Overcrowded prisons, Camilla, back on the agenda. This is one of those big issues, I think, alongside health and the economy, that Labour needs to fix or fail. It's announced today multi-billion-pound grand plan to build 4 new super prisons, creating 14,000 new places. But even with that big amount of building, the Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood says we're going to run out of space within 3 years. Even the most optimistic scenario of prisoners will overtake the supply of prison places by November 2027. By November 2032, there'll be 5,000 more criminals in jails than there are prison places to house them. I was just doing a little bit of research before we started this podcast. The number of people in prison in 1991, 40,000. Number of people in prison in this year, 88,000. Crime over that, 40-year period, 30-year period has gone down.
But the population has gone up. So has the prison population just risen with the actual population? Maybe. Or we're putting people away for longer. That's the other problem, right? That's
sentence inflation, which we'll get onto maybe after we've spoken to Robert Jenrick. We'll talk about things like sentence inflation. But let's listen to Mahmood laying out the new plans today when she spoke to Nick Robinson on the BBC's Today programme.
Well, let's turn to your ambition to build more prison places. 14,000? The promise to build more prisons, 3 at least. Even if you achieve that, will we simply just have another prison crisis in 2 or 3 years' time?
The capacity strategy that we are publishing today sets out clearly the plan for how we will deliver 14,000 prison places by 2031. That's the timeline we're working to. It's the most detailed, transparent plan that any government has come forward with. It marks a total shift from what was happening under the last administration.
But you'll still have a shortfall,
yeah, absolutely. And we're very honest and transparent in the strategy itself that building alone is not enough because the demand for prison places is rising more quickly. The demand for prison places is actually 4,500 extra every single year. Even with the emergency measures that I've been forced to take, that's 3,000 every year. We can't get there just by building alone. That's why I set up the sentencing review just a few weeks ago, because we need a longer term solution.
To be clear, even with 14,000 extra places, 3 new prisons, you could run out of cells within 3 years.
We will run out because even all of that new supply, with the increase in prison population that we will see as a result of that new supply, doesn't help you with the rise in demand, because demand is still rising faster than any supply could possibly catch up with.
That was Shabana Mahmood, who is the Justice Secretary. She is in collaboration with Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, in how they're actually going to make this work. Because, as you know, Kamal, when there's an application for a prison in any area, it's usually met with a fierce amount of objection by local residents concerned that, I suppose, having a prison in your backyard might lead to crime in the local area. It doesn't quite make sense, that, does it? Because the prisoners are, by definition, behind bars. But we know that the state of our prisons hasn't been good for some time, certainly in terms of smuggling in drugs and violence within prisons. Maybe people are also worried about prison riots and such like. Also, prisons aren't the most attractive of buildings at the best of times, so they're probably a bit of a blight on the landscape. Rayner's solution is to say, look, we need to just push through these prisons. Normally, you would have an application go through the Development Control Committee and then be approved by County Council. She's saying that we need to strip that back, and basically, if the prisons are needed to be built, even on green belt land, they should be pushed through. My immediate reaction to that is that I do have a prison in my backyard. I've got HMP The Mount Prison in Bovingdon, which is in the village next door to where I live. And at the time, I think it was built in the 80s, and it was built on the site of a former RAF base. So there were local objections. And I did subsequently hear a bit of chat about, this place has gone downhill since the prison was built. But let's be perfectly honest. When you pop into Bovingdon to get your loaf of bread and your coffee, you're not really seeing the prison or being affected by the prison or anything. It is in a part of countryside just outside the village. I mean, we have to house prisoners somewhere. It's a category C, so maybe that makes it a bit more acceptable to the local area. It's got a young offenders institute in there. There was a recent report suggesting that its drugs problem was completely out of control. That's not unique to the Mount. I think that's the story that's being told with behind bars across Britain. So we have to have these spaces. You made this point about the prison population increasing. My other reaction to this story is, do all of the people that are in prison need to be there? I did some work, went and visited different prisons, as you know, and I'm an ambassador for an organisation called Tempus Novo, which is about rehabilitating non-violent, non-sexual criminals, getting them jobs basically so they don't end up back in prison. And I met some people, I met this guy who had been found guilty of dodgy accounting, and he was in there for 18 months. And I just thought, this is a bit of a waste of time. Why is he behind bars? Yes, of course he should be punished. I just didn't think a custodial sentence served anyone's interests in that case.
We have a rather cliched view, don't we, of prisons, still thinking about Victorian prisons. I also have a prison very near me. I live in North London, Pentonville Prison. One of the most notorious prisons in the past is a few streets away from where we live. As you say, you get very used to it very quickly. Most prisons, particularly outside the big cities, aren't those old Victorian prisons. They look like almost shopping centres with very high walls and razor wire. There can be some issues around the delivery of drugs via drones and some criminal activity around prisons. I think that's very true. But as you said in the introduction to the podcast, this decade is going to be defined by the battle between not in my backyard and yes in my backyard, NIMBYs and YIMBYs. And the government has placed a very big and controversial bet on yes in my backyard, that they can somehow take voters with them. And I think the big political problem will be for the government. And tomorrow we're expecting the other half, exactly as you said, of this announcement. It is justice plus Angela Rayner and planning. Tomorrow we're expecting the government to come forward with their planning legislation, which will make it much more easy to enforce, that the national government enforces on local communities, the building of infrastructure. Now, prisons is one of those things, but it's also going to be pylons, it's going to be data centers, all sorts of things that supposedly push growth or net zero. And this is going to be a real battle over the next decade. And what the government will start running up against is their majority is big in the House of Commons, their majority amongst voters is very small. This idea of the sort of loveless majority. And there's real controversies here. On the actual numbers of prisoners, we have been involved in this arms race over prisons for many, many decades. Again, I was just looking back at some of the data. One of the biggest shifts in prison numbers was actually down to legislation passed in 2003 by Labour under Tony Blair. When we started setting, legislation was passed that in the UK, we started setting statutory minimum terms. So people couldn't come out until a certain amount of time had been served.
Presumably that was tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. Yes, because, I've got to look like I'm being tough on criminals,
because
basically.
Because the very few governments do well on liberal prison policy. The polling all shows, and it still shows, that the public lean much more towards punishment by incarceration rather than punishment in community settings where, as you say, if it's an accountant and financial fraud, or somebody that hasn't had a direct violent effect, we still think they should be in prison. And that debate has not changed much. And governments have allowed this ratcheting up. And the judiciary complain that they are trapped in codes that mean they have to send people to prison. There's very little discretion for a judge. Once a person is in before them and they get a certain level of sentence, they have to go to prison for a minimum time and then not get released for a longer time. And then every time we up the amount of time you have to serve, particularly for serious offences, that pulls up all sentencing because of the scaling. They want to make sure that you're not just leaving behind more minor crimes. So everything rises, the tide rises, and then all the sentencing for all crimes rises, because judges argue we need to keep the proportionate difference between different crimes the same.
Although the public perception is that sometimes sentencing is disproportionate. People will cite the example of the woman that posted the incendiary remark about the Southport riots ending up behind bars for 18 months. First offence, she's a grandmother, she was caring for her husband. Is there really any point comparatively? We know that when people kill people in cars, they get quite low sentences, really. They're not behind bars for a long time. And, you know, somebody has died as a result.
Again, you will see this clash with planning. A lot of the prisons go right back to when Boris Johnson pledged in 2021 that there'd be 20,000 new places, new prison places by the middle of this decade. Alex Chalk, the Conservative minister, just before the last election, just before the election earlier this year, admitted that actually those 20,000 places, only 5,900 had been provided, and he brought down the target to 10,000. One of the main reasons for that is these prisons get stuck in the planning system. And it's our old friends, the waterweed streams and the newts and the people can not only tackle it in terms of blighting their views or the traffic that might be created, they can also do multiple challenges on environmental grounds. And that means that a number of these prisons just haven't got off the planning books. And this is the big problem. And why it's quite bleak, Camilla. This 1991 figure that I spoke about at the beginning was at the time of the riots at Strangeways Prison. Really appalling events where people said the prisons are so overcrowded. 1991 this is. Prisons are so overcrowded. At Strangeways, the prisoners actually took over the prison. 2 people died, 100 and I think it was 90 plus people were injured. Lord Wolfe came out with a report saying our prison estate is in a complete mess and needs complete reform. Where are we today? People are very worried about riots again.
Yeah.
You feel so, depressed is too strong a word, but so bleak about the ability of government, that's both local and national, to actually solve a problem that we have had in front of us for decades. Because on one side you have we need more prisons. On the other side, you are constantly ratcheting up the number of people in prisons, and your planning law is stopping you build prisons. It's such a mess that the public look at it and no wonder trust in the ability of politics to solve problems declines.
But does prison work? I mean, that's a subject for a whole other podcast. But just looking at rates of recidivism in the UK, 75% of ex-inmates reoffend within 9 years of release, and 39.3%, so 40% say, within the first 12 months. So going back to my point with my Tempus Novo hat on, you know, if you're really that likely to reoffend, then we need to be asking ourselves whether prison has any point whatsoever beyond just the punishment part. By the way, I want to see criminals of all persuasions punished, particularly those who have carried out violent and sexual crimes. You know, I'm quite happy for them to be locked up for a significant amount of time, just in the interests of public safety. But when it comes to your fraudster or your prolific shoplifter, or people who are committing, I mean, I don't like the term petty crime because it's not petty to the person it affects. I would really rather see these, you know, vandals, petty vandals, people who set fire to stuff, people, you know, persistent offenders who happen to be teenagers, you know, the type of people that used to be slapped with ASBOs, who might suddenly appear at a young offenders institute. I'd actually far rather they carry out some community service that not only teaches them a lesson, but actually integrates them back in society and maybe gives them an opportunity to meet people who do good things who do good things for the community that might inspire them to live a different kind of life. Like the whole point about, I get punishment, but actually prison doesn't really redress the unfairness in society of those who only ever take and never give back. So I don't know why community service isn't a bigger thing. Maybe we just have problems administrating it.
Yeah, I think they do want to. I think this will be part of the sentencing review we're going to hear about next year. The former Conservative minister has been hired by the government, David Gauke, to come out with this review. That's going to be heard in spring. If you look at what the public want, I was looking at some of the polling that's been most recently done. This is from YouGov. The most popular thing to try and tackle this issue is releasing foreign nationals early so they can be deported. And Kemi Badenoch raised that in Prime Minister's questions today. And I think there are about 10,500 criminals who could possibly be deported. So that could be something that we could investigate. The second most popular is building more prisons, but it's very easy to say build more prisons as long as it's nowhere near me.